I can never tell how we are completely live. All right, awesome.
Live. We are live.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Scott, and this is Riley, and we're back to kind of bridge the gap between March and not really October, March and November for your Division III basketball viewing pleasure. And just talk about all things Division III women's basketball. Riley, how's the offseason been so far?
It's been pretty good, Scott. Had the chance to step away from all the crazy coverage for a little bit, but got back to it pretty quickly once we started seeing schedules coming out. And I've been so excited ever since I started to see some of these non-conference matchups set up. Just can't wait for the season to unfold. And really, there hasn't been a week that's gone by without some kind of coaching news or transfer news. So it's definitely been an eventful offseason up to this point.
Sweet. It looks like I am frozen on the live stream. Hopefully that does not keep persisting. But let's hit our agenda. So we've got a pretty full slate. We might cut it off at some point if we're talking for too long. But we've got 8 topics. We're going to talk logistical changes, conferences and bids, some good stuff there. We're going to look at some of my preseason rankings, and you get to roast me because I am making a million assumptions, many of which I'm sure will be wrong. We'll look at some schedule breakdowns. Both Riley and I have been looking at schedules, and there's a lot that you can tell from them, even at this point. We'll look at fifth-year returners because we're still in this COVID fifth-year era where we might have potential fifth-year returners, and we'll also look at a few transfers. Next up will be Frosh to watch. I am still frozen on the live stream, so I don't know if any of my audio is coming through.
We can hear you. Just you're frozen on the video.
All right, no problem. So then number 6, we're gonna hit. So for 5 is the Frosh to watch. Looking at the freshmen from last year that produced the most per minute and also played a good amount of minutes. Number 6 is top young teams. So this is looking at the teams. Not just at the teams that returned a lot of production, but the teams that got a lot of production last year from freshmen and sophomores. So they might be good this year, but watch out for next year. 7 is a regions breakdown. And so like regions are different, and we'll talk through some of those differences. And then the last topic is RRO madness. So we'll look at some projected really strong RRO matchups and some projected really weak and talk about some of that. Let me try to, well, actually here, we'll find a good stopping point and I'll mess with my camera. So we'll first hit logistical changes. You want to start walking through some of these, Riley? Skip a bullet if you don't know what it means.
Yeah, exactly. No, some logistical changes that went on over the course of just this off season, some news that came about for us on that front. Wilkes and Lincoln both went to the Landmark, South Virginia to the new MAC. So those are some teams that are moving conferences, which is always an interesting element of things to consider. Just when you look at these coaches have to get used to scheduling and game planning against new teams. The players have to get used to playing against some new teams, and that goes for the teams within that conference that they're joining too. So those are always matchups to keep an eye on, teams to keep an eye on too, and kind of see how they fare in the midst of a new conference schedule. When you look now at games for Warren Wilson and Asbury, they now count for your primary criteria. Of note as well, it's not on the screen, but Sul Ross State, which is going to Division II next year, was approved for a waiver recently, so they will still count as a Division III opponent. Which is notable because everyone that schedules them, particularly in the ASC, really needs that game against Sul Ross State when it comes down to everything that goes on in Region 10. I don't know who all Sul Ross is playing this year, but every single one of those games will count as a Division III game for their opponents. Additionally, the CSAC and NECC are no more, so we say goodbye to 2 conferences, which does open up 2 Pool C bids. So we go from 19 to 21, which will create some interesting conversations come selection Monday and kind of, how everything fits into that. We've been used to 19 for the last couple of years. Now we'll be up at 21. Scott, I don't know if you want anything on that Pool C topic before we keep going.
I mean, it's going to make our jobs harder, right? Two more
Right.
teams to predict, and they're going to be in that fringe period where we went back and forth among, I don't know, like 5 different teams for that last spot last year and didn't get our prediction right. And we might have to do that 3 times this year. But back on the provisional. So Mississippi University of Women is a full member, which means they're eligible for everything postseason. Warren Wilson and Asbury, teams could play them last year, but any wins or losses or strength of schedule impacts, none of that was counted because they weren't into, I think, year 2 of provisional status. Now they were year 1 last year. Now they're year 2. So they count for other teams' primary criteria, but Warren Wilson and Asbury are not eligible for postseason themselves. And then there are other teams like Hartford, Leon, actually, I don't know how to pronounce that, Leon or Lyon, and Carlo, that are provisional year 1, I believe. So they're not eligible for postseason, and games against them do not count for your primary criteria. So some of the shifts, there were other shifts, of course, with those 2 conferences closing. Their schools had to go elsewhere, and so they are elsewhere, and so there are other changes. Let's look at some of my rankings. So what I was doing is looking at how many games the team won last year, their NCAA resume, how many Division3Hoops.com poll votes they got, their Massey ranking, and then also how much production they returned, and trying to smash that together into a prediction for this year. Now, actually, I shouldn't have used the word prediction. I've been using the word projection because I know that these are going to be wrong. A team that won 20% of their games last year and return everybody doesn't mean they're going to win 80% of their games this year. But I think, if you have 2 teams that won 20% of their games this year and one of them returns 90% and one of them returns 30%, I think we're pretty sure the one returning 90% is likely going to be better. So those are some of the principles that I was working with. And these are my top 10 as it stands right now. Both Transylvania and Christopher Newport have some key 5th-year returners that keep their returning production percentages really high. And the only reason you'd really bump them off the top couple spots is if they graduated a ton, and neither of them graduated a ton. Among these top teams, Scranton, NYU, and Smith graduated the most. But because they were so strong and so dominant in a lot of these categories last year, they definitely will stick around in this top 10. I think Baldwin Wallace was kind of an interesting one. They faded at the end of last year, but all the data is really strong, like strong winning percentage. They graded out well by a lot of, like, the top 25 poll, the Massey rankings, and the NCAA resume are all they're pretty different rankings. Right. And Baldwin Wallace graded out really well in all of them. They returned 74%. The average team returned about 70.5% of their production. That's lower for better teams, which makes sense because usually the better teams have more upperclassmen. The average returning for the top, 50 or 75 teams is closer to 67%. So I don't know. Baldwin Wallace was kind of an interesting one to me.
That's an interesting one to me too. They'll play Trine early on in the season, and I think that's going to be an interesting matchup. I think it'll tell us where both of those teams are at. Admittedly, Baldwin Wallace was a team I had pretty high for the majority of the year. I wasn't too sold on them, although the parts in the are definitely there. The playmakers are there. I think they always have a decent schedule in non-conference. I've seen everything that they have scheduled, but I imagine they'll have some good opponents in addition to Trine. They're an interesting one with this group because you start to go down the list, a lot of these teams you would, just think of off the top of your head based on their performance last year and kind of what we saw from them. Baldwin Wallace is a fringe team to me. I could see them going either way. And it's really going to be interesting to see what happens over that first month of the season. I think we'll learn a lot about a team like Baldwin Wallace at that point because they do return a lot, and I think they have the potential for a lot of success this season, especially in the OAC.
Yep. And again, I'm running off of limited information here. I don't know recruiting classes, the strength of that. And so it's limited information for sure, but I think it's an interesting first look at some of our potential strong teams of this year. And there's not a whole lot changed, which I think as a fan, we'd probably prefer a whole lot of turnover, but we should see a lot of the familiar faces. Oh, it looks like I've got 11 through 21. I wanted to include Trinity, Texas down there at 21. So this might be a little more interesting. Now, most of these teams won a lot of games last year. The lowest winning percentage was Amherst. They won 68% of their games, but they return everybody.
Yep.
And so I'm expecting quite a bit from them this year. Messiah is another one that kind of maybe a little bit under the radar. I don't know if they had the strongest SOS last year, but it definitely was not below 520, I don't think. But they won over 90% of their games, graded out well in a lot of the metrics, and return just about average. And then my favorite team of last year, Gustavus Adolphus, that Massey loved. And I mean, I think they had a pretty strong run through the tournament and almost pulled it off against Whitewater. They return a lot, and I expect them to be solid once again.
Yeah, I think they'll be really good. And, as we know, the MIAC, with their conference schedule and that kind of setup, it does challenge teams like Gustavus Adolphus. I was very high on them. I think I had them in the top 10 for most of the second half of the season, if I'm remembering correctly. They passed the eye test when you watched them play, but then statistically they really lined up well. They had, won pretty much everyone that they had played, they had beaten, especially in some of those bigger games. And so I definitely think a team like that has a lot of potential heading this year. Loris is another one that really stands out. And even going further down, I think Puget Sound is one that we're going to want to keep an eye on. Out in Region 10 on the West Coast, it's easy to forget about those teams sometimes. And, they tend to float in and out of the top 25 just because of that fact. And sometimes, their schedules aren't always the strongest based on who they can play. But I expect Puget Sound to have some really, really good matchups this year in non-conference. And I think that just based on who they return, everything is there for them to have a really, really good run this season and end up as a top 20 team.
Yeah, I think Region 10 might be one of the regions that looks the most different across the entire landscape this coming year. So let's look at some of these schedule breakdowns. And kind of the principle that I was working under is you can kind of make loose projections on how strong teams are going to be. And then when you look at schedules, you can say, hey, they play 20 conference games, and we know that in your conference games, your SOS is 500 because everybody plays everybody, one winner, one loser. It's got to be 500. And so it's only every team's non-conference games that really allow it to move outside of it. And if you play a bunch of teams non-conference that are going to be about 500, you can say right now, hey, if you win 90% of your games, your SOS is not going to be good enough to get a Pool C selection. So this is a lot of prognostication, but I think there are things that we can pull out from this. So some of the first schedules that I saw were Tufts and Trinity of Connecticut, and they have held up. It's just strong across the board. In my headings there, C is conference and NC is non-conference. And I threw in that number of conference games because I think it's just really interesting to see that on average, the fewer conference games you play, the higher your conference SOS is. Not on average, that's a mathematical rule. And so Trinity and Tufts have such a huge advantage there. Mary Washington has could have a similar advantage. But I also projected out the number of RRO games that I think a team could have, including from their conference and their non-conference. This does not include your conference tournament. So your conference tournament might give your SOS a bump a little bit, and it usually adds one RRO matchup if you get to the finals. Sometimes adds two if you have a strong conference and that semifinal opponent is also ranked. And so kind of I'm combining your overall projected SOS, your number of RRO games, and my preseason rank to kind of throw it all together into that stat column to kind of project if you might be able to put together a strong Pool C resume. Now, I am not predicting like the winning percentage of Trinity. I don't know if they're going to be a 600 team, if they're going to be a 950 team, and obviously that has a huge that's a huge factor in whether you get an at-large bid or not, if you should need one. But everything about their resume makes it so that if they perform well, they have the ability to get a Pool C bid, which gives you that buffer. You don't need the Pool A from your conference. Yeah. Any thoughts, Riley?
I think that's the best way to say it, right? Because we're not sitting here trying to predict who's going to win games right now here in the month of July, just because there's a lot that can happen. We don't know full rosters. We don't know those kinds of things. But we can, as you said, look at it and say pretty quickly, okay, this team is, in the running for maybe a Pool C if they need it, or they're just going to have to get to Pool A, or they're probably not going to get in at all. And I would say that, that first scenario where you have a good number of really solid non-conference games, it puts you in a better position as a team. It also puts you in a much better position when it comes to rankings and things like that. But my initial thought when I saw both the schedules from Trinity and Tufts, I'd also throw Babson in there, Springfield too. We talk about all the time the Northeastern conferences and specifically the NUMAC and the NESCAC, with them playing fewer conference games, it allows them to play non-conference games against really good teams in the month of January. And I don't know if people quite understand how valuable that is. A lot of these teams that we're seeing across the Midwest are having to play their really, really good non-conference opponents in November, whereas, Trinity and Babson will play right after the new year on January 2nd, or you look at Tufts and, they get into that stretch right after, Christmas or right before Christmas, I should say, where, they're playing Emmanuel in New York. They're in early December. Springfield has a similar stretch after the new year in January. Those games are really, really big for those teams because they're already in a position where they've been playing together games for 2 months, and now they can put it all together and make a run at some of these teams that are regionally ranked. Those are the big games. And on top of that, I would just say, looking through some of these schedules that we know right now, and we could go through all day looking at games that we like. NYU has a really, really good schedule, and one that I think people need to be paying attention to, especially opening the year with that Scholars Classic. They're going to play some good opponents early on, and I think the UAA schedule, can only help them when it comes to their national standing.
I never thought about the fact that geography means that you could play non-conference games later into your season, which kind of cuts both ways because you might be better, but your opponent might be better as well.
Exactly.
But I don't know. I think every team would rather have their most meaningful games when they are at their best, even if it means that their opponent is also at their best. And so, that's interesting.
It's just a thought. I mean, coaches are welcome to correct me on that based on the way they see it. I have heard several coaches, though, say in the past that those games in November and obviously now with the 8-day rule and you can practice a little bit earlier, that may help things a little bit. But teams with starting practice later in the year, October 15th, in past years, it doesn't give you a lot of time to get all the chemistry together, especially if you have some newcomers. And when you do play later in the year, I mean, even this stretch I really like from Springfield, they play Roger Williams on January 1st, Smith on January 6th, and then Babson on January 10th. That's a great setup for a team like Springfield. I really think that's a position in the schedule where you can make a big impact. And you go 3-0 there, I think you're Pool C eligible immediately, even as long as you posted a decent record early on, because we know these teams in the Northeast schedule well throughout.
Yep. I liked breaking out the SOS by conference, non-conference, and overall. And you can see like a team like Trine or Transylvania, I have their conference SOS pretty low, which you can't control, right? You have to play whoever's in your conference via whatever, whether if you play them twice or you play them once, you got to play them. And Trine's non-conference SOS, at least by my calculations, is second highest. Marietta's 782 is kind of a wild non-conference. They are playing great teams across the board. But it just shows how you might have to work really hard in non-conference to get your SOS to a Pool C level. And I only included the top 15 of my schedule rankings here, but let's look at a few more because we'll see some that have SOS or RRO numbers that could be problematic. So you see Ithaca there with an overall SOS of 521. Reminder, this is a projection. It will be wrong. This does not include conference tourney. There are a lot of things that can kind of change this, but 521 would be a number that wouldn't have made it last year, even with like a 950 winning percentage. And so if they do end up with an SOS around there, it might not matter what their winning percentage is. Similar for Washington at Lee, 528, or Milliken, 525, Washington Jefferson, 509, Concordia Moorhead, I have below 500. And so you can kind of start to see, like, I think if you're Concordia Moorhead, it's Pool A or bust, unfortunately. I'm only seeing about 3 RRO games, and that's going to be a tough sell as well. And so you can see Illinois Wesleyan and Hope have just a tick higher SOS by my numbers, but about 4.5 RRO games. That's also kind of on the razor's edge. You probably need to go at least 2-2, if not 3-1 or 4-1 in the games that you have, and your margin of error is just a lot smaller than if you're Babson, right? If you have 9 or 10 or 11, if the first one you lose, that's probably fine. You don't have to go undefeated the rest away in those RRO games. But if you're playing 2, 3, 4, you need to win more than you lose, I think.
Well, and that's where when you play in a little bit of a weaker conference, it puts that much more pressure on you to perform well, in November and December, because those are when you're going to get most of those RRO games. And so I think it's an interesting dynamic to follow. There's going to be teams, I think, that we know, like a Tufts or a Trinity, where, they don't have to win their conference, and they're probably going to get in as long as they post that decent record throughout their non-conference games. But, when you're coming from a weaker conference, you have to know, and credit to those coaches also for going out and scheduling tough opponents. I've seen it done both ways, where you just go for the Pool A and you don't worry too much about what your non-conference SOS looks like. But I would say when you look at the approaches of some of these teams coming from a little bit of a weaker conference, going out and scheduling really, really tough, it can only help their team. It puts them in a better Pool C position, and it gets them ready for the conference schedule, which if things play out the way we expect them to, they should be right there for that Pool A.
And I find it interesting that for the teams that do play in really strong conferences, like take Rochester with that 637 conference SOS, you don't want to go schedule a non-conference SOS like Marietta did. You absolutely don't. And so theirs might even be on the slightly too strong side of it, if there is such a thing. Like, now granted, there's a lot of value to playing strong teams aside from your NCAA resume. But thinking just about an NCAA resume, if you know that you're going to have a rockin' SOS inside your conference, and a rockin' SOS means your opponents are winning lots of games, which means it's going to be harder for you to win a lot of them. We see that in the UAA, we see that in the WIAC, we see that in the NESCAC. And if that's the case, you don't need to give yourself this crazy test in non-conference, because you could end up like Rochester last year, right? Didn't they have like a 600 winning percentage and a 640 SOS? And even though the SOS was so good, they just didn't win enough games. And you would run the risk if you scheduled too strong non-conference. I don't think anyone's done that. I mean, Trinity's schedule looks pretty wild, so like maybe they did, but hard to tell at this point.
It's hard to tell. And the other thing is too, I think you tend to just have to kind of look at probably your team, look at, okay, what are we going to put on the floor, and how good do we feel about, our roster? I know Trinity feels really good about the players that they have coming back, and, kind of being on par with where they were last season. It's an interesting thing, and I don't think people quite understand the pressure of scheduling on these coaches. We're looking at these schedules in July. They had to make these schedules probably in part during last season, not knowing if they were going to return fifth-year players, not knowing what some of these teams were going to look like that they're going to be scheduling games against. It's a tough thing, because, as you said, you don't want to schedule too tough. We saw it on the men's side a little bit last year, where teams went out and scheduled maybe a little bit too tough, and it hurt them, or put them very much in the bubble come selection time. But I don't know if there's necessarily a case where you're going to schedule too tough because you look at a team like Tufts. I think they're going to schedule some really, really good opponents, but in the NESCAC, they're not playing a ton of conference games. It probably works for them to go out and get some really, really good opponents and then, play in the NESCAC and see what happens. I think when you have a really, really good SOS, that's going to catch the eye of the committee. And as we saw last year, they reward those really, really strong SOSs.
Yep. So flipping back to the slides here, to sum up schedules, there's just so much really, really interesting information there. And I find it helpful to highlight how some teams just are held back by their conference that they can't do anything about. I don't know what the exact solution is, but if Trine and Concordia Moorhead let's say Concordia Moorhead goes and wins 90% of their games and has an SOS of 5-10 and goes 3-1 against our opponents, they might not really have a shot at a Pool C because they couldn't control who they played. I guess that's a bad example because it's not that the MIAC is weak at the bottom. It's just that there's so many games, and that's already changing for next year. But take a SLIAC team, right? Like Webster. They could win 90% of their games with a decent non-conference SOS, but their in-conference SOS is just going to be so low that they have no shot at a Pool C. And I think it would be nice to find a way to figure that out. I don't know what it is, but a lot of the at-large selection becomes conference strength influenced. So let's look at a couple fifth-year returners that we do know about and some key transfers that we know about. This is not exhaustive and is not a source of truth. So it could be that we report someone is returning for a fifth year and it's actually the case that they're not. But there's some big names here. I just have this sorted by my production metric, which is points plus rebounds divided by minutes. And I stopped there. So that, of course, is going to slightly overrate your forwards because I'm not including assists, but there was only so much data entry I could handle. So, but I mean, Anaya Simmons and Deja Thornton, I mean, those are huge, huge returners. We see a lot of Transylvania here on this list. Key players, Booth from Rhode Island College. Simpson kind of had a down year last year, but I think they were surging at the end of the year. I kind of expect them to get back to the kind of normal heights that they were at for quite a while. Bonnie Jensen at Ripon, Rochester, Whitewater, Stevens Point, all return key players, and that's a big deal. These are players that were extremely productive, and I'm not on the inside of any of these teams, but I would imagine that a lot of these are leaders on their team, and it's always great to have that leader come back for another year.
Absolutely. It's interesting, too, just to note these fifth-year players we've gotten used to talking about, almost always this is due to the COVID year and everything that played into that. The one thing that I think should be noted from this list that just kind of sticks out to me, you go down this list and a lot of these players are players that we knew about early on, in the year, and going through last season, they were in the, player of the week discussion, player of the year discussion in some cases. When you look at a player like Callie McCauley from Rochester, who has been around for quite a while, she did not, she started off her career, didn't play a whole lot. I think she's a player that could really take a step up, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Katie Titus was big for Rochester last year. I think McCauley could be the same for Rochester this year. That's why, personally, I think Rochester is going to be a top 25 team right from the get-go because they do bring back players like this who are going to step up. And, Katie Titus was so good last year, but they had a lot of players around her that just would tend to get buried in the stat sheet if you weren't looking far enough down there.
And another player coming back for Rochester on a fifth year is Hannah Lindemuth, who I believe played one game last year due to injury and was an extremely productive junior. So that's another player that, Rochester's almost getting completely back and not just returner after a big year like McCauley was. But some other big players here for, teams that we expect to be really, really strong. Like all of these are key players coming back for their squads. Couple transfers out. I'm not sure if all of these were seniors. I think they all were. But these are all, well, no. Aaron Doherty, Catholic, went to Division I. Nikki Carter from Montclair State also transferred to Division I, but Bridget Monahan was Elizabethtown, I think, and has transferred to Scranton. So that's a key change, I believe.
Say that again.
Did Bridget Monahan go to Elizabethtown?
She is going out. She is going to St. Joseph's at the Division I level. Elizabethtown did lose a player to Scranton. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but yes, yeah, Monahan is going to play at St. Joseph's and rep Scranton at the D1 level.
Yep. So these are 3 seniors that have transferred out of Division III. But then a couple transfers in. So Toomey is coming to Scranton, and I don't have all the research of what levels these players came from, but Toomey, I think, is a pretty big transfer coming into Scranton. Ava Bardich coming to Illinois Wesleyan sounds like an extremely, extremely accomplished player. Carlisle coming into Whitman, Whitmore to Trinity of Connecticut are both strong players. And Wisconsin Stout was a team that kind of had a really strong year last year. Pretty young team, but very, very guard heavy. They were not a large or tall team. And last I heard, they were getting a transfer that was 6'2". Don't know the pedigree background, but that would definitely be a very unique area of need for Stout and could really, really change the look of the team.
Yeah, Stout's a team that I think could do some big things in the WAC this year, just with the players that they have from back. I mean, we watched them last year, and they beat Whitewater, and they came up with some huge wins. Just barely missed out on making the tournament, but I think they're definitely a tournament team this year, in my opinion. A note on Toomey, she comes from Ryder. You know, she's a Division I transfer, and tends to be where at the Division III level we see a D1 transfer. It kind of catches your eye. But then you start to look and say, okay, well, how much did this player actually play, for her previous team? Because it tends to happen where you have, former D1 walk-ons or players like that who come down and they're certainly valuable, but they don't have the Division I playing experience that you might initially think about. Toomey's not that case. She started all 31 games last year for Ryder. She averaged 9 points a game, 4.5 rebounds. She's going to be a huge force. She's from right there near Scranton, from Dunmore, 6'2" center. She's going to be a big impact transfer for Scranton, I think. And there's a lot to like about that Scranton team heading into the season.
Absolutely. So just a handful of transfers that we know about and looks like they could provide an impact, but that's another piece of information that can really, really change the competitive landscape. So some Frosh to watch, again, using my crude production metric of points plus rebounds divided by minutes. I'm only looking at players that played at least 200 minutes. And I also limited it to teams that I project to be a top 100 team. And just some of the top freshmen from last year that are now going to be sophomores. And everyone knows that Mary Schlusner was just an incredible player, but it stands out so much more how productive she was.
Yeah.
And it's a big jump down to Trinity Matthews and Sydney Viz, and then another kind of jump down to Jacqueline Castro. And it just, I was blown away watching Mary Schlusner whenever I watched her last year, but the production was really, really, really good.
Yeah. And that's a big thing. I think when you have freshmen who are excelling at the college level, it's such a big jump from high school or college. It says a lot about what they can do in the future, because if they're doing this as a freshman, what's going to happen in a couple of years when they have that collegiate playing experience and they've finally gotten into a little bit more of a rhythm. All those players on that list, I think, are going to be in for big years this season.
And then some more, we get to the second page, and Casey Cranston kind of stands out on the second page. kind of because of how far down she is, but I think that's largely because of just how many minutes she played last year. It's if you produce at 300 minutes, it is hard to keep that same rate up if you play 600 or 800 minutes. And I think Casey Cranston played just about the most minutes of any of these freshmen. And so she was extremely, extremely productive. And for players like Mary Schlusner, it will be interesting to see what sort of production they can maintain while playing minutes similar to Cranston in this sophomore season. But yeah, I'm always interested in production from freshmen because in Division III, you just have far less transfers away or playing only 3 years. And so you can really project that they're going to be around and productive for quite a while.
And Scott, really quickly, I just want to note something. Anaya Simmons from Christopher Newport was originally reported to be coming back, but recently, as of just a couple of weeks ago, she decided not to come back, I believe, due to the effects from her knee injury. So she had a great career at Christopher Newport, but she will not be back. So just a quick note there that I was wrong on.
Which definitely would change their spot because she was such a huge part of what they did. They are bringing Katie Rader back, but they have, I can't remember their post presence who graduated from last year, but it is a lot of talent to graduate last year, and then Anaya Simmons down low, but I expect them to be strong once again. Then top young teams. So these are teams where I was looking at their production from freshmen and sophomores last year, and that I project it to be a quality team this year. So top 125 team, but it's sorted by underclassmen production and not by where I project them to be this year. And standing out is Chatham, who got basically 100% of their production last year from freshman and sophomore. And I think that they can be a really strong team this year. Let's see where I have them ranked. I have them at 72 overall, 11th in Region 7, and I think they're my number 2 team from the President's Athletic Conference. So I think Chatham can be really, really interesting already this year. But then looking ahead to the year after, by using my what percent are going to return, they're going to return close to 100% next year in addition. And so, I mean, going down this list, Stout, Amherst, really Stout and Amherst stand out is we're probably projecting them to be top 20 teams already this year, and they're going to graduate by far the lowest among all teams from this year. So, and then teams that maybe aren't completely on people's radars yet, like Muskingum or Northwestern of Minnesota, LaGrange, North Central of Minnesota. But I think they can both be strong this year and get even stronger the year after. Because just like I said, hey, if you win 20% of your games and return everyone, it doesn't mean you're going to magically win 80% of your games. But all these teams like won good amounts of games last year. I think they're going to win more this year, and I think they're going to win more the year after.
Right. And I think what stands out about a team like Stout or Amherst is that they're playing in these really tough leagues. And obviously with Amherst last year, kind of the story was that, they weren't in the top 25 for the first time in several years. They, just weren't up to par what we normally expect, them to be. But that was because they had such a young team. And you look at when you can return an entire roster, any coach will tell you that's invaluable to bring back that many. And every team on this list, I think, does stand out for one reason or another. I mean, you look at a team like Chatham, as you said. I mean, they had a lot of really, really good players last year. When you watch them, they passed the eye test. They played well together. When you bring back everyone with another year of experience under their belt, it'll only help you. And I think we could see a pretty significant increase in win production from a lot of these teams.
And one thing you said earlier was it's such a hard job coaches have creating a schedule because they're scheduling with such limited information so far in advance. But I think if you're scheduling for next year and you can book, like if you're in Region 7 or a close geographical region, 6 or 8, and you can book Chatham, Muskingum, or Carnegie Mellon non-conference, I think it might help your SOS in a really, really, really big way. Next topic. I guess we're already to 7. How far into this are we? 40 minutes? We're kind of
40 minutes.
cruising. All right. So 7 is the regions breakdown. I don't know how soapboxy I'm going to get here, but all regions are not created equal. And because there's the same number of regionally ranked teams in each region, if you happen to be a strong team in a weak region, it means that you have access to teams that are regionally ranked, but easier to beat than teams that are in strong regions. And so what I just have here is a region and then the average preseason rank of their top 8 teams. And then also how many teams they have in my top 100. And then also what the 10th ranked team in their region is ranked overall, just to kind of give different ways of looking at the quality of a region. So I think region 9 is just going to be crazy. Like the average of their top 8 teams is 24th overall. They're like, I have the 21st best team in regions 9 and 7 is better than a regionally ranked team from region 4. Now, I don't know if that's going to be how it plays out, but it just like it shows that, you know, we have to have 7 and only 7 ranked teams in each region, regardless of the quality of that region. And so if you like the difficulty of beating the number 7 ranked team in region 7 versus region 3 is just so wildly different. Like take Transylvania, if they roll into the 7th best team in region 7, they might have a, you know, 60, 70, 75% chance of beating them. They roll into the 7th ranked team in region 3 or region 4, they might have a 98% chance of winning. And so I guess I'm not advocating for anything here. I think it would be nicer if the number of ranked teams per region was more ratio based on the number of teams in each region. But I do think that Division 3 is very regional in nature. And I don't think you would want to create a top 60 or a top 80 that might have 2 teams from region 2, you know, or 1 team from region 4. I think some amount of we want to be ranking teams from every region is good. But I think I'm just illuminating the fact that the ranked teams that you are beating in regions 1, 8, 7, 9 is very different than 2, 3, 4.
Oh yeah, we had a question from a loyal viewer just before we got on to the podcast, asking what's going to take for a team to be regionally ranked in region 9, and it's just so tough for those teams because they're playing in these really good leagues. They're having to go out and schedule tough and non-conference because they want to be regionally ranked, and the only way you're going to do that is by going out and getting one of the best non-conference schedules out there, most likely. It's just such a interesting kind of situation for these teams, in those regions that you see in 9 and 7 and 8 and 1. They have to be so much more intent with their scheduling and who they really get, because a lot of what comes down to the regional rankings, because we're ranking a lot of teams from the WIAC, maybe a few from the MIAC, the ARC if you're looking at region 9. It's going to come down to who they play in non-conference, I think, because as we saw at the WIAC last year, Platteville at the bottom of the league standings was being Whitewater, who was number 1 in the league standings. You got to be prepared when you're playing at a conference like that to go out and get some really good opponents in non-conference to help you and maybe give you a leg up once it comes time for the racks to rank those top 7 teams.
Now, this question gave me some interesting thoughts, because I think the kind of record in SOS to get regionally ranked in a region might actually be fairly constant year over year, because if you're, let's say, region 9, a lot of those teams are playing each other. And so I think it kind of keeps all of the resumes in check. It's going to be very difficult, even if region 9 is really strong, to have 12 teams that all win 90% of their games with a 580 SOS, because they're all kind of playing each other. And that drives everything closer to 500, both on the winning percentage and the SOS. I think it just means that, hey, you might look in region 9 at the 14th team and it's Co. And if you drop them in a different region, they might be better than, Vassar or New Jersey City. I'm just pulling teams out of there. And so I think it'll probably be similar numbers to get regionally ranked in Region 9 as it was last year. It was kind of, if you've got a 700 winning percentage, you need an SOS closer to 600. And if you've got an 800 winning percentage, at least have your SOS be over 545 or 550. I think it's going to be very similar this year. It just might be harder to accrue those sorts of resumes this year than it was last year, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think, we're going to see these same regions once again in the spotlight, especially come February, where we're watching and trying to figure out how is the regional advisory committee going to, rank these teams in any particular order, because you're looking and you're trying to compare head to heads and things like that. And you and I tried to do it last year right before the selection Monday. It's tough with those regions. Some of the regions down below, 2, 3, 4, a little bit more clear cut. But when you get to the top, it's so tough when you're trying to compare those resumes against each other.
I mean, I remember hearing a current coach and former RAC member comment on how they know how regional the system is, right? And the point that they were making was everyone on the rack knows that an 800, 550, 3-2 team from one region does not necessarily equal an 800, 550, 3-2 team from a different region. Because you can construct the exact same resume against actually different quality opponents, because everyone is not playing everyone. If everyone in Division 3 could play a round robin against everybody else, you could just compare everything perfectly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case. And so, a 20-4 team from one region might have constructed it against different quality than a 20-4 team from a different region, even if their non-conference SOS are also the same, which I think would break some people's minds. So we're already to our last topic, man. This could be short and sweet, or we might riff on some other things.
Yeah,
so some RRO madness. Again, this is all based on my projections, which are going to be wrong. But what are some of these non-conference matchups that look just incredible? Actually, we're going to start with the easy edition. So I have Trinity playing Coast Guard, which I have right now inside my. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever put a projected regional rankings in July. It's probably a bad idea. But I've got Coast Guard there, but I have them as my 125th overall team. So in the grand scheme of RRO matchups, that's an easy one for Trinity than it might be for another team. Brooklyn College is playing Ramapo, who is 113th overall. So is NYU. Elizabethtown playing Dickinson. They're outside my top 100. A couple games versus New Jersey City outside my top 100. Then everyone who's playing MIT is pretty quality. They're already into my top 80. So, pretty quickly, you're not getting any really, really easy RRO games, but these are definitely not created equal, because we're going to flip to the X Games mode. So these are my overall rankings in parentheses. You can see, Tufts versus NYU. It's a lot harder for Tufts to beat NYU than it would be for Tufts to beat Coast Guard. But it goes down as a potential 1-0 or 0-1 in the RRO. Regardless, of course, it does affect your SOS differently. I bet you NYU wins more games this year than Coast Guard. Sorry to Coast Guard. We're picking on them just because they happen to fall into that spot. But we can already see so many of these games from Tufts and Trinity.
Right. Multiple times. Yeah.
Right. The Elizabethtown versus Christopher Newport one kind of stands out. I don't think they played last year. And they're not that far apart geographically, but it still stands out as it seems like an unlikely matchup. Do you know if they've played much recently, Riley? I think one of our viewers might chime in with the full how often they've played.
Hopefully, yeah. If you know, please comment below to help us. But yeah, I think I mean it makes sense a lot from a regional perspective. It seems like they would play more. I don't know the exact answer to that. This seems like a matchup though that makes a lot of sense for both teams. Christopher Newport, we know they always want to get some good non-conference and playing in the C2C. doesn't necessarily allow for them to rely on a really strong conference to help them. But just when you start to go down the line and look, there's a lot of teams on there and on just those X Games mode that you listed out that are going to be some really intriguing matchups where right now we have no idea who's going to win those, but I have a feeling we're going to be talking about them come Selection Monday, 2024.
Yeah, and I didn't put down the dates that these are occurring because I don't think we know them in all the cases. But I bet you some of these are in November, right? And it reminds me of that, was it Springfield and Rochester matchup on the first day of the season? And they were both at the final Pool C table. And we said, hey, we think we have to eliminate, was it Amherst? Because they lost that matchup?
Amherst and Spring. Yeah.
And, it just shows how important even the first game of the season could be. Or to go back to Stout, I'll bet you if Stout had won one more game at any point in the season, they would have been 1, 2, or 3 spots higher in the regional rankings. They would have been on the Pool C table before Wartburg, and might have gotten in the spot that Wartburg ended up getting in because they were higher in that table than them. It's just when you're at those fringes, a single game can matter, right? Exactly. Now, if you were the 6th out of 19 teams picked in Pool C, you had buffer. It didn't matter what happened in that one game. But for those, I don't know, there's probably around 15 teams that if one result goes different, could mean the difference between getting into the tournament and not.
And I remember last year when we were on the selection show on Sunday night, we were sitting there and you and I have been doing that for hours prior to going on the air, but we were getting to that last couple of picks, still trying to figure out, who was the best team out of that group currently at the table. I can't believe I forgot, but Elizabethtown and CNU actually played last year in the tournament in the second round. CNU won by 10 points, 65-55. Before that, though, they didn't play since the 92-93 season. So if I'm looking at this right, this will be the first regular season matchup between those two teams since 1992-93 season. So that's pretty interesting there. Been quite a long time since those two teams played in a regular season contest.
Yeah, and that kind of, that brings us to the end of my planned topics. But talking about this Elizabethtown versus CNU matchup, it reminded me of a text I sent you last night where it looks like Lake Forest is hosting a tournament that includes Calvin University, make that clear, Concordia, Wisconsin, Lake Forest, and McAllister. So I think that's 4 different conferences represented. And that's just cool because I don't, it doesn't come to mind seeing those teams play each other. And that's always really cool to see. Whereas seeing MIAA teams play WIAC teams, it seems like it happens every non-conference slate, and we love it. But it's cool to see teams that don't hit your mind as having played recently.
Well, and it's cool too when you have teams, as you and I said, teams from different conferences, different states playing and not playing at the tournaments like the D3 Hoops Classic, although we love the D3 Hoops Classic, or the Puerto Rico tournaments, or the St. Petersburg tournaments. It's nice when these actual schools are able to get 4 teams from different conferences. They can all drive there. Those are the most ideal matchups because it allows for a little bit easier scheduling. Sometimes when you get into those tournaments where you got to fly, it can be a little bit of a hassle for teams to actually set those up due to budgets or whatever it might be. But when we see in the Midwest a lot where you're getting 4 conferences together, and that really creates, I think, some interesting data come Pool C time. You start to look at head-to-head matchups and you realize, okay, well, these 2 teams play each other, or these 2 teams over here play each other, can really be beneficial. I was going through earlier trying to look through, see some of these other tournaments that might be along similar lines. We see that in the Northeast quite a bit, where we're getting 4 different conferences to one tournament. But credit to Lake Forest for getting that all set up.
Yeah, and for a lot of these tournaments, if they have a championship game and a consolation game, I don't know who's going to win those opening round matchups. And so I either leave it blank or I take a guess. But I think there's a chance that we get Rochester playing Baldwin Wallace. That's a fun one.
Yep.
Looks like Transylvania's playing Eau Claire and Wisconsin Lutheran. Those are fun matchups. A little bit of a travel for them. Actually, I don't know. It's a little bit of travel from someone from Wisconsin to Kentucky. Ohio Northern and Trine, that's probably pretty close geographically, actually.
Yeah.
Looks like Redlands is playing a couple teams are traveling to Redlands, Milwaukee Engineering and Concordia of Chicago. Those are kind of fun. A team that could be interesting is Oglethorpe. They return a ton, but I don't see any non-conference from too far away. It looks like they play Worcester State, which is not going to be super close to them, but everything else looks pretty darn close.
Yeah, I mean, most of them, and that's interesting when you start to go through these schedules. I mean, you and I at this point have probably gone through, I would guess, close to 100 schedules, probably more. You start to find these interesting matchups in there, and it just excites you as a fan when you're gonna, get to see some of these interesting things play out. There's another one just because we're talking about it, it's interesting. Berry College. I came across this, or you did, and you had messaged me about it, but. Barry goes out to New York City and plays Marathon Baylor and Williams. When to get those two matchups, like that's so uncommon. I would think in New York City they're playing at Baruch College. You play a team from Belton, Texas, and then you play a team in Williams from up there in the Northeast. Like two completely different opponents from two different regions, and you get to play them on a neutral court. It's just a really good setup for those teams that are going to be playing at that NYC Invitationals, as it's going to be called.
Yeah.
And even, I was going to say too, just as a quick additional note to that, I mean, a lot of people have said the NYU opening weekend tournament, the Scholars Classic, where you can get MIT there, Johns Hopkins, Washington University will also be there, but just that'll be a really good tournament as well to open up the year. We talked about NYU playing a good schedule. NYU versus MIT November 10th, like that's not going to be one you're going to want to miss. That's going to be a really, really good matchup there, I think, right out of the gate.
For sure. I'm trying to eyeball some of these. It looks like Gettysburg has put together a pretty good schedule. They're playing both Trine and Marietta. I think those are some really fun matchups of teams that felt like, I think maybe 2 seeds come tournament time last year. Obviously, we don't know what they're going to be this year, but those look pretty fun. We already talked about Rochester potentially playing Baldwin Wallace. Milliken playing Platteville. Illinois Wesleyan playing Hope and Whitewater and University of Chicago. Those are all fun.
Those will be good.
Concordia Moorhead playing a couple WIAC teams, Stevens Point and Whitewater. I think I saw potentially 5 WIAC teams on Rippon's non-conference slate, which, not far geographically, but still like kind of trying to shove yourself into the WIAC and play some really strong teams. Case Western and Marietta are pretty close to each other. Calvin playing Pacific in Oregon. That's a fun one for sure.
Yep.
Wheaton going to Pomona Pitzer. Augsburg playing Stout. Augsburg, I believe, is in Minnesota, right? I'm assuming every MIAC school is in Minnesota. That would make sense.
I believe so, yeah. And even, I mean, Trine hosting Stout, I think that'll be a really good matchup. December 16th, I believe that is. That'll be a good one for Trine. They get them at home. I mean, honestly, too, like this isn't really a crazy geographical matchup, but Marietta going to Ohio Wesleyan, I know there's no road multiplier, but I think this will be a good matchup for them. I really like Ohio Wesleyan. I think I said this going back to last year in February that I thought Ohio Wesleyan was going to have a really, really good season this year. Just watching them play a couple of games, I watched them play DePaul. I think anyone playing Ohio Wesleyan could be in for a really, really good matchup. I think those are going to be some of the games that we're going to be wanting keeping an eye on. There's a lot of interesting ones as you start to go down through here. I mean, a lot of teams making some good trips. the California trips seem to be more popular, and probably that's coming out of COVID, and traveling across the country is a little bit easier now for some teams. But yeah, we saw that last year, a lot of those trips to California, and going through the schedules this year, there's a lot more of those trips out to Puget Sound. In fact, I think too, and I gotta find it, but going down the list, I mean, Colorado College is playing NYU. I think that's going to be a really, really good, really interesting matchup. You and I have both talked about Colorado College and kind of what they bring to the table this year. I think the Tigers out of SCAC are definitely going to be a team that could be regionally ranked, probably will be regionally ranked by the time we hit February. And so matchups like that, I mean, Colorado College has scheduled themselves a really, really good slate. Another one too, Sul Ross State is going up to Whitworth. Again, not sure exactly how good Sul Ross State will be, but they were pretty good last year, and they bring back quite a few. And just the fact that Alpine, Texas, probably the most remote Division III school now in the country with Finlandia, no longer open. They're going up to Washington. That's not a matchup you're going to see very often either.
Yeah, it looks like Ohio Wesleyan has some non-conference matchups against Ohio Northern, Marietta, and Washington and Jefferson. All of those should be tremendous matchups. Some teams traveling to Pacific would be Calvin, Co, and Carleton. And I could be totally wrong. Like I'm eyeballing all of these inputs, but the other one that I was looking at was Claremont. What's the alphabet? Okay, L before O. Claremont. So like Wheaton and Tufts and Whitworth are all traveling to Claremont. What's another one? Pomona probably is a good one.
Right.
Pomona. So it looks like Wheaton and Tufts are traveling to Pomona. Those are the only non-conference ones that I have traveling to Pomona, since I don't think I have Pomona's full schedule. I don't have Colorado College's schedule. Is it out?
I don't believe it is. The only matches I've seen for them, and I can look at it real quick, have been from other schedules that I've seen them on. I've seen them on Whitworth's schedule now. As I mentioned, I saw them on NYU's schedule. Let's take a look at that. Yeah, I mean, Whitworth did a good job, I think, of getting teams to come to them, which is sometimes a challenge for those West Coast teams. Oftentimes, it seems like they're the ones that have to fly out to get these good non-conference matchups. But honestly, it looks like teams are going to be coming to them this year, which is pretty ideal for being a team located all the way up there in the Northwest.
Looks like Puget Sound is traveling themselves to Hope.
I think Puget put together a really good schedule. I know the plan is for, and I don't know. Pretty sure they're going to be going to play Trinity. They're going to be hosting Trinity of Texas, which, again, Trinity of Texas was on your list. We're not exactly sure what they're going to look like. They lost a few key players, but Trinity should still be a very good team. I expect them to be regionally ranked. And Colorado College's schedule is not out as of right now.
Okay.
The Texas schools, most of the schools in Region 10 actually don't seem to have their schedules out yet. I know quite a few are complete, just maybe not posted online yet.
Right. But one thing that keeps coming up again and again for me is I think Region 7 could be really interesting because a lot of the top teams in that region graduated a lot. So specifically the 4 main MIAA teams. And a lot of that kind of middle tier of the region, which was not weak last year, all kind of brought back a lot. And so if Ohio Wesleyan and Chatham and Wittenberg and Hanover, a lot of these teams are 10 to 25% better. I think it makes for, Carnegie Mellon, Case Western, the other top Ohio Northern will all still be there. It's hard to count against Hope and Trine and Washington and Jefferson, but there could be a lot of different teams vying in Region 7. And I see something pretty similar in Region 8 too, where Chicago and Millikan and WashU all graduated a lot. And so there could be a lot more Region 8 teams moving up. And parity is absolutely fun for the fan. Every school, of course, is wanting to maintain their spot, but parity is great for the fan.
That was always the conversation with the WAC last year, right? Like teams were going to these games where, especially there where the conference tournament, not everyone gets into the conference tournament, and just craziness is happening. It seems like every night, that they were playing, and we saw it a little bit too in the UAA, especially. It's really interesting when you get on to those later months and you see games playing in February. I mean, that's when some of the biggest upsets seem to happen. I was actually gonna throw in a quick side note. The tournaments that Whitworth is going to be playing at, they're going to be playing at two, as I mentioned. Sorrel State is hanging up there. They'll also get Colorado College in early December. Those appear to be hosted at Whitman, so not a long trip for Whitworth, but Whitman with some really good opponents as well. And I wanted to just pitch a question to you, a little bit off topic, but still keeping on with the idea of scheduling non-conference. I wrote this in my newsletter a couple of weeks ago. The idea of teams still scheduling tournaments versus scheduling classics now, where they know the two teams they're going to be playing. In a tournament setting, you can have an upset happen. Hope is big on the tournaments, I know, and they're fun for the fan, right? Because you're going, you don't necessarily know who's going to play in the championship game the following day. But from a strength of schedule perspective, from a RRO perspective, what happens if the team you were counting on playing that second day loses, and now you ended up not coming out with a regionally ranked opponent, at all, or projected regionally ranked opponent? I mean, that's an interesting conversation, I guess, to have from a scheduling standpoint on should teams gravitate more towards these classics where they know who they're going to play, or is still scheduling with a 4-team tournament type setup, beneficial?
Yeah, and I don't know the dynamic of what all the participants are wanting, right? But if I think I'm the best team at the tournament, I want to control it. I want all the control over who my opponents are. Because unfortunately, if you've already put together a pretty strong resume, beating a really bad team hurts your resume a lot. Yeah. That's just the way that it is. And so again, if two teams have similar, like identical resumes that are already strong, if I beat a really bad team and the other team loses to a really strong team, their resume gets better and mine gets worse, right? I don't have an RO matchup. And we saw with Wartburg that RO losses might not really hurt you.
Yeah.
Of course, your other criteria have to be strong because you're looking at the whole resume. But your SOS gets crushed if you play a team that's 3-22 for the year. And your SOS, even if you lose the game, goes up if you lose to a team that's 22-3 for the year. So if I was a coach and I'm trying to maximize my pool C chances, I would angle for knowing my two opponents whenever possible.
Right.
Now, I'm sure there's a ton of you're building relationships. You're not wanting to demand stuff. There's always give and take and compromise. But I think as much as possible, you want to know.
Right. And I think it's a good mix maybe to have one where you're playing that tournament type setting and another where you're playing in that classic type event. And I know there's teams that have two, or I don't know of anyone that has 3 of those type of tournament things, but I have seen schedules where there's 2. And you know what? At some point, I mean, I don't know, as you said, the agreements that go into all of that, but you would like to have some say over who you're playing, especially because, as we said time and time again, even here on this show, that one game could drastically impact whether you get in or not. And of course, I think a lot of these teams are, in a position where they're not going to necessarily be at that point. But again, you never know what's going to happen in the conference schedule and how many losses you may end up taking. And you don't want to be in a position where you get to the end of February and now you're right on the bubble for a Pool C bid.
And you also see teams opt for that classic model when there's 2 teams from the same conference in that 4-team.
Right.
tournament. Because when I was a student, there was a year where Hope and Calvin men played 5 times because we were in a tournament early in the year. Then we ended up matched up together, 2 regular season matchups, conference tournament matchup, and then an NCAA tournament matchup, because geography just kind of put you in the same, I think, opening weekend pod. And, you know, regardless of the kind of matchup that it is, that's not ideal to play 5 times in a year. So I think there's a tournament of sorts down in Texas, including, is it UMHB and another is that ASC?
Yeah, I believe it'll be Mary Hardin-Baylor, East Texas Baptist, Trinity of Texas, and Rhodes, which should be a very good tournament that opening weekend. A lot to like, 4 teams that I think are all going to be really good. But again, yeah, you do have, I guess in that case, you have 3 different conferences represented. Trinity's still in the SCAC for this year. So.
But if you want to avoid conference matchups, you don't have a whole lot of leeway setting up that sort of conference. But
it's pretty easy, yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's just really interesting learning more and more about scheduling. And, some teams have the budget to travel, some don't. Some teams, like, I know we've seen schedules where teams don't play for 25 days, kind of in that December time period. And maybe there's something about the class setup, the holiday setup, whatever, that's just how they do it, right? There's also, like, I talked to a coach of a provisional school that they're scheduling a certain way this year, but definitely planning to schedule much differently as they get further down that provisional route. And so there's a lot of stuff where it's easy for us to look at a schedule and be like, that's pretty weak. You have no pool C chance. Why are you doing this? But it's not that we know that they had the opportunity to schedule harder and turned it down. It's just that we're saying, hey, like, you probably don't have a chance, like, from day one. And sometimes that's within a school's control, and sometimes it's not. And at least the most public ways when it's not in your control is when you're in a weak conference. And I would just love for, like, we talked about Trinity, Texas versus Tufts last year, which is, a great microcosm of the debate. You take out the 2 worst opponents in, is it the SCAC that Trinity of Texas is in?
Right. Yep.
That they each played 2 times. You take that out, and their SOS is 40 or 50 points higher.
Yeah.
And you're no longer thinking of their SOS as like, oh, well, it's so much lower. And you're like, it's not that much lower, and they won more games.
Yeah.
And when everybody knows that both Tufts and Trinity are beating those teams 4-0, like, every time. And so I would love for there to be a way to not count those games, but it sounds like it's just not something that anyone would ever entertain, creating some sort of threshold where you drop games against certain kinds of opponents. But it is tough when, you're hurt when you beat that 2-23 team, and a UAA team is not hurt as much when they lose to that 15-7 team or whatever.
Well, and as I've talked about with a few coaches, and I said this earlier too, but they're having to schedule out, like, trying to finish their schedule sometimes before December ends of that current season. They're trying to schedule this, put the schedule together for the following season. That's really, really difficult to do. You don't know how teams are going to end up looking that following year. So you're having to guess somewhat on who you're going to get. But I would say, too, the other thing just to note, it's really easy for us to sit here and say, well, why couldn't they travel more? Why couldn't they do this or that? We do know from both of us having conversation with coaches, like, there's budget restraints, and there's things that coaches just can't do. And they have to make the most of the opportunities that they have, the teams that are willing to come to them, or the places they can get to by bus, or whatever the situation might be. And so sometimes it is out of their control. But you got to give credit to the teams that find a way to somehow arrange some of these interesting matchups where they're able to get a classic together, or whatever it might be. And too, this is where geography again comes into play, as it does in a lot of things in Division III. Just your Region 10 teams are going to have to fly usually in order to not play another team in their conference, especially on the West Coast, and can create some big challenges at that point. because you're talking about a couple of flights per year, which isn't always possible. So, I think ultimately a lot of these schools did a good job with scheduling. I mean, the schedules I've seen so far, I haven't seen really any that just look awful. There's been a few that are not as strong as I would have liked them to be. But for the most part, it seems like everyone's getting on board with this idea of, okay, we need to go out and schedule some tougher opponents and try to keep our win percentage high at the same time.
Right. And just to bring up one example, because you're totally right that you can't know how strong a team is going to be. But last year, Mary Washington got probably one of the final 4-ish Pool C spots. They had a 769 winning percentage and a 545 SOS. I would bet if their SOS was 535, they might not have made it.
Sure.
And they have a non-conference game against Averett, who won. Their winning percentage last year was 136. Probably hard to think that their winning percentage is going to be over 300. And so again, I have no idea, maybe they play every single year. But that single game, what did I have Mary Washington's SOS projected for this year? 551. So like really similar to last year. And if it ends up that way, I guess 551 would be enough. But if it ends up like just below the cut line, like it would be tough as a coach looking back and saying like, hey, if I didn't schedule Averett and I scheduled a 500 team, like any team that has a reasonable chance to be 500, we would have made the tournament.
Yeah.
And so now granted, I'm looking at all the non-conference games from schedules that I've seen against teams that I expect to be really, really bad. And there's just not very many involving a top 100 team. Like I've got Carnegie Mellon, Bates, and Case Western, all with a game against a pretty weak opponent. But like Mary Washington plays Averett and Hood, and those are going to be really, really tough for their resume. Again, like there are other reasons to schedule a team, but those could absolutely at the end of the day be the singular reason that a team like Mary Washington doesn't get in, especially if their winning percentage isn't closer to 800, if it's closer to 700, or if it's 692, which is optically less than 700, but basically the same. And
we know things can happen too, right? Like, as much as it seems like a team may win, 80% of their games right now based on, their schedule outlook, there's things that happen, injuries that happen, and teams lose a game here or there. Like those are the positions you don't want to put yourself in, where you are already playing a couple of weak opponents, which drops your SOS, and then you lose a couple of games you probably shouldn't have or wouldn't have lost if you had a healthy roster, and then you find yourself out on the outside looking in come Selection Monday. So yeah, I mean it just, I think, goes back to this whole topic of scheduling is so important to teams and whether they get into the tournament or not, and everyone has a different approach to it, I think, but ultimately in the end of the day, the teams that we're seeing consistently getting these opportunities at Pool C's, they're typically playing strong conferences, but they're also going out and they're not afraid to schedule other top 25 teams. They're not afraid to put that winning percentage on the line a little bit.
Yep. And at the end of the day, I think the NCAA tournament is doing the right thing, which is, hey, we want to pick the teams like via whatever means we can that are like have done the best. Right. And we can only look at who they did play. And if we know that they played someone that should have been really good, but they lost their key player first game of the year, well, like that sucks a ton.
Yeah.
But you can't really account for it, even though it's not that team's fault that the team that they played were supposed to be a lot stronger and weren't. It's not your fault, but we can only like judge teams based on what did happen in this current year. And there will always be things in Division III that are inherently unfair. Geography is really the biggest one. And short of guaranteeing tournament bids, NCAA tournament bids by geography, which I think a lot of people wouldn't like, there's probably not really a good way around it, which is not a defeatist standpoint, but I think it's, hey, if you're Williams, like your path to the NCAA tournament is absolutely easier than it is for Whitman or it is for ETBU,
right,
or Webster. And that it's unfortunate. We wish it was exactly equal for everyone. But like even in I grew up in Seattle, so my favorite teams are the Mariners and the Seahawks, and they fly the most miles of any team, right? Because we're way out in Seattle. And sure, it's unfair, but you're not going to do something to account for it. You're not going to give the Mariners a 3-game head start on everybody. It's just kind of, the way that it is.
Yep, and it's one of those things too where, like, as I know the debate always happens when a team gets left out, come tournament time. It's the Division II model is much more regionally based, and I guess there's some positives to that, but I really value the fact that Division III still has a national tournament, and I think last year we saw the committee do a really good job of creating these national matchups within the pods. But when you do have a national tournament, it does start to account for geography and how teams play. And this isn't even, it's interesting to me coming from a Division III perspective, and not to get into a whole nother sport, but Division I baseball this past year during their selection show, the committee chair, who is from Auburn, got into kind of this discussion where basically all the host sites were in the Southeast, and college baseball with the SEC and everything down there really does excel in the Southeast. But it created this big geographical difference where you have very few teams from the Midwest, very few teams from the Northeast. And, so we're seeing across the board, when you have a national tournament, you're always going to have that aspect of geography that comes into play where certain programs have an advantage and certain conferences have an advantage over others just based on where they're located. And there's not much you can do to fix that or change that.
Yeah. And I think it is good for the entire competitive landscape of Division III that everyone gets exposed to all the different geographies as much as possible. And so maybe because of that, I'm more okay with the imbalance region to region, because, hey, if it's a little bit easier for a team in one region to make the NCAA tournament than it is in another region, it's still it slightly spreads around the regions that are in the tournament, right? Because if we tried to more structure the regional rankings based on who are like the best 70 teams, well, hey, maybe you get 16 teams from Region 9, and you get 12 from Region 8, and you get 12 from Region 1, and you get 4 from Regions 3 and 4 total or something. And even if hypothetically that includes the best teams, it would be less geographically represented, which would have some detriment, I think, to just general, like, people following it, people learning about schools, and ability to have really cool matchups of teams that don't normally play each other. All that, I think, is good for the longevity of schools and sports in Division III.
Especially because if you have that kind of a setup, as you just mentioned, you're inevitably going to have some, well, you're going to have conference matchups playing out in, the second round at the very least, and sometimes maybe in the first round based on geography. I mean, there's 12 Region 9 teams there. There's only so many ways you can structure that. You obviously have Region 8 near there or something like that, but it's much better, I think, to have that national tournament where everyone's included, and represented. And I think the Pool C process does favor some of those stronger regions, so you still have a little bit of that. Obviously, good teams are going to get left out every year, but one of the things too that I think I would note as well, like, people talk about the Region 10 all the time, how Region 10 doesn't get the respect it deserves, and I would agree in some cases where it does feel like the teams out here in Texas where I'm at, or in California, Oregon, Washington, are at such a major disadvantage just from the fact of they don't even feel included at times in these big conversations about who the best teams in Division III are, and when it comes to top 25 rankings and things like that. But I think what we also have to remember is that the regional advisory committees and the national committee have really done a good job, I think, the last few years of trying to evaluate those Region 10 teams a little bit better. And if it was the case where Region 10 teams were never getting to host in the first round or whatever, then you could say, hey, there's a big issue here, but that's just not the case. And I think they do the best job they can to try to get, the pods to be hosting some of those Region 10 sites, and, make all the regions ultimately feel like they have an equal value in the eyes of of the committee in terms of, kind of what they bring to the table. And if their best team, the number one team in the country, is from Region 10, we had this conversation last year, would they get to host the sectional? Part of me thinks so at this point in time. A few years ago, probably not, but we might be at the point now where they would consider, putting a sectional in Texas or in California if the best team was there. And I think that's a lot of progress for Division III.
Yeah. But man, if I am an enterprising AD or head basketball coach and I've got unlimited budget, I would just book, find what I think might be the weaker regions and
Right.
just hunt RO opportunities. Because if next year your non-conference slate involves, Vassar, Cortland, MIT, Stevens, Rochester, Roger Williams, and Ithaca, you might have an 850 non-conference SOS against 6 or 7 regionally ranked teams that, as on average, are probably going to be easier to beat than if you're showing up to play, Mary Washington and Puget Sound and Trine and Whitewater.
Yeah.
I because that would be, if there is any kind of quote loophole, that would be it, because
Right.
it would be teams outside the weaker regions benefiting from the weaker regions. And you see this a little bit where like Christopher Newport played a bunch of teams that ended up to be really weak, but regionally ranked this last year.
Yeah.
And I have no idea if that was intentional, right? Because so much of this just happens. But that would be a really, really interesting thing to do, because if you are a top team, you need to play a team that is going to help your SOS and regionally ranked wins, or a team that you are never going to lose to.
Yeah.
Like one of those things, needs to happen. And so some of these, in that way, playing a team like, actually, I don't know who this year would be a team that's going to win only 60% of their games, but be really good. Maybe like Oberlin.
Yeah.
Like I think Oberlin might be a strong team, but they probably won't help your SOS the way that playing Washington and Jefferson would. And you might have a heck of a time beating Oberlin. Not terribly dissimilar from the heck of a time you'll have beating Washington and Jefferson. So no, we could probably talk endlessly about schedules and all the shades of gray therein.
Right. I was just gonna say too, like Marietta actually did that. I mean, Marietta went out, and they're gonna get Gettysburg at home, and then they're gonna get Oberlin. And I mean, those are teams, that I think could give Marietta a really, really good test right there. December 29th and December 30th, Marietta gets them at home. I mean, yeah, I think that's a good setup there for the Pioneers.
For sure. So I guess we stretched it out. I don't know if we stretched it out, but we got to just about 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will tide over the Division III women's basketball fans for a little bit, as we're still 3.5 months from real games. But I bet you we're going to get more schedules dropping soon. We just stumbled across Transylvania's today, but I think we're still, what are some of the top ones we're waiting for? We're waiting for Christopher Newport, Scranton, DeSales, Wartburg, Smith, Baldwin Wallace, Loras, Rhode Island College. So those should be coming out. And then I don't know when rosters come out. They'll probably come out in October, right?
Yeah, I think not till teams probably start practicing and they can start doing all that. It's interesting too. Just one quick note: Scranton has not been on any schedule I've come across, which is really interesting. I saw this note or that brought up on D3 boards today. So I'm really interested to see what their schedule is going to look like and some of the teams they might be playing, because again, we don't have a lot of the top team schedules out, but it is interesting not to find Scranton on any of them that we've seen so far. And as I mentioned, you've gone through a ton of them, Scott. You can find them all on your website and your schedule ranking. Interesting to not find Scranton on any of those.
Yeah, I haven't seen Scranton on any non-conference yet. I haven't seen DeSales on any non-conference yet. I guess I have seen Christopher Newport on a couple non-conferences. But yeah, those are a few teams that we just have not seen. I think Wartburg, maybe I have not seen on a single. No, I have. They're on North Central Illinois and Cornell. No, I have seen Christopher Newport. They're on Elizabethtown and Maryville. But yeah, so Scranton is probably the biggest mystery at this point, and we think they're going to be strong, bringing back a lot and pulling in a big transfer. It could be a pretty interesting year in the Landmark.
It could be.
Thanks for joining me, Riley. Thanks for the people that are watching. Thanks for the people that watch in the future. Let me make sure these last two comments aren't something. Yeah, Platteville could be a 600 team that you don't want in non-conference. Platteville similar. River Falls. I think Cal Lutheran is a team that won almost 60% of their games last year, and they returned to everybody, and they could kind of be a big spoiler out west. And it is, yeah, like those teams that are solid but aren't going to win over 75% of their games are almost the worst kind of teams to face, unfortunately, for your schedule. But thanks everyone for joining us, and we will catch you next time.